Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. In the name of God, most gracious, most merciful, and may God's peace and blessings be upon His holy Prophet Muhammad and the purified members of his household and progeny. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. So we are at the fourth session, the third lesson from the book Theological Instructions, or Islamic Lessons in Islamic Doctrine. So the title of this lesson can be translated as the condition, or the conditions, but there's only one, the condition for humanness or living a human life. So before getting into the outline of the lesson for today, maybe a very quick summary of what we've covered so far, and then we can move to the subject matter for today. So lesson one was an introduction to the notion of religion and how religion is split into two halves, two components, one of them being the system of beliefs and the other is your system of actions. And the system of actions itself, so because we're getting more and more to the details, I'm adding these, it's not really a system of actions directly. It's actually another system that is reasonable, rational, or intellectual, let's say. It's a theoretical system, but it has to do with your actions. Whereas the first half is a system that has to do with your, it's called speculative, or it's theoretical. So there's a belief system, what do I believe in? And then if I believe in those things, my mind tells me, but I'm still in my mind. I'm not actually doing it. I'm still in my mind. My mind says, therefore you must worship a God, for instance. Therefore you must believe in so and so, and let's say you have to have some sort of worship, which can be prayer, fasting, pilgrimage, and so on and so forth. But it's still a rational system. We're not yet in the world of action. Okay, so that's a little detail, but it's not really that important, but we will use it today. So I mentioned it. That's the first item. So we said there's what usually has been referred to as usul ad-din and furu' ad-din, or the system of beliefs and the system of actions. And we talked a little bit about both. We said that the system of belief is basically your answers to the major questions in your life, your existential questions. Any human being should have those questions. Where do I come from? Where am I going? What's the meaning of life? What am I doing here? And so on and so forth. The answers to these questions are considered your worldview. And the therefore I should do or I shouldn't do, that becomes your system of actions. And we also added a few more details saying that there are what the author calls false and true system of belief or worldviews. And we talked a little bit about those. If you have an unaltered, pure human nature, then you will believe in certain things and lean towards certain things. Whereas if you don't have that pure nature, because you're too distracted by the elements in your life, or because you've deviated for some reason in your life, then you may not feel the pull towards those beliefs and those actions as strongly, or not at all. Or you may feel a pull towards contrary things. And the rest was more complementary around that. So really it was more about the terminology and making sure that we understand the notions that we're going to use for the next lessons. And in grosso modo, that's the first lesson. Second lesson, we said, okay, so now that we understand what religion is, we want to understand why is it worthwhile to study religion? Why is it important to study religion? And even more than that, what we said is, why is it necessary to study religion? Why is there we can't say religious because we're not in religion yet, why is there a logical necessity for studying religion? And so we started with a number of arguments. The first one was, we said that human beings are curious. So when we know that there's some knowledge to be had, we go after it. That's in general. Then that becomes a much stronger argument when we start looking at, so what type of knowledge are we talking about when we talk about religion? And the nature of the questions, the nature of the knowledge that we're trying to get makes that curiosity a lot stronger, because it's very determining for both this life and possibly the next, if there is a next life. So that was the argument from, let's say, the seeking knowledge or curiosity. The second argument we said can be split into two sub-arguments, or we keep it lumped as one big argument. And we said it's basically the instinctive drive in human beings to seek what is beneficial to them and to protect themselves against anything that's harmful to them, any danger and any harm. And we're not going to expand on that anymore. I think it's straightforward enough. We said those two can be looked at separately or as one big argument. The third argument that we looked at was what we called the religious sense, that a lot of psychologists say exists as a possible fourth dimension in the human psyche. So you have your leanings towards everything that is good and that is beautiful, and also religion. So if you look at human history, you will see throughout that religion in one shape or form has always been present, which tells us that there's a human drive towards that is always there, regardless of time and space. There was also one more argument that we said the author doesn't necessarily present it straightforward, very directly, but it's implied. And so because it's a very famous argument in philosophy, we spent a little bit more time explaining what it is. And we referred to it from the angle that it's known in the West, which is Pascal's wager. So it's based on the logic of probability, where we said that if you think that there is a very high probability towards something, you may move towards it. But if you think that the probability towards a gain in whatever endeavor is very low, you may not move towards it. That's the objection. So in the case of religion, the probability may be very low. Who says I'm going to ever be able to reach some sort of certainty about religion? And so the answer to that, the refutation to that is you cannot look at one factor only, which is the probability. Maybe the probability is low, but what's the probable? What's the thing that has the probability? What's the possible outcome? So maybe the probability is very low, but the wager you're putting is very high. So you can't just look at, let's say there's only 5% or 10% chance, but the wager you're putting is infinity, your whole life and possibly infinity. You're putting your entire eternal life, if there is an eternal life, but that's what you have to look at. And at this point, all we're saying is, therefore, there's a necessity to look into religion. We haven't yet said, and religion is true or false or anything of that sort. So that's generally speaking, lesson 1 and lesson 2. Lesson 3, the author is still in the same question. Why is it necessary or important to study religion? And he's basically going back to the same argument, but he's going to present it from a different angle, and he's concentrating on the second argument, which tells us that from the arguments that we presented, let's say there were 3 direct ones and one that was implied, probability. From the 3 direct ones that he presented, it was the second one that was the main one, which is instinctively human beings lean towards what is beneficial and try to protect themselves against harm. That was the main argument. And we talked a little bit about that. We said the religious sense could be a very strong argument, but the problem is because it's an existential feeling, it's something that you're supposed to feel immediately. Anyone can claim that I don't feel it, and there's nothing you can do about that. Your theoretical refutation to how someone is feeling will not go far, because what they're feeling is what they're feeling, and it stops there. And we'll talk about that, as we said, in the next lesson. And so the types of knowledge, and one type of knowledge, there is no argument against it. When someone says, I feel pain, you know, that's what they feel. There's nothing you can say that will change the way they feel. And that's why the author himself said, let's put that argument aside. Let's not even really concentrate on the religious sense. We know it's there, but we're not going to push it too far. We can come back from another angle. And so this lesson is the other angle. So generally speaking, that's why I put a 5 here. So if we say that lesson 2 had 4 arguments, then lesson 3 becomes the 5th argument. Okay, he's adding one more. He's taking that same argument but putting a very philosophical twist on it. And the argument is really based on the idea of perfection and how human beings seek perfection. So what we said in lesson 2 was human beings seek what is beneficial and protect themselves against harm. He's putting another spin on it, which is, and human beings seek perfection. And the whole lesson is going to be built around that idea. And as I mentioned in lesson 2, there's another version to the argument that he doesn't really talk about directly, and I'm not going to explain it more than I did in lesson 2, and I don't think you could find entire works on it, but generally speaking, I think it's straightforward enough, which is the love of the self. So all of these can go under the idea of the love of the self. You're aware of yourself, and therefore you do everything for your own survival and for your own benefit and for your own perfection. All of that goes in under that more general heading. So the outline for this course. So keeping everything we said in mind, so we're continuing on the same argumentation. This lesson basically says, in short, and that's number 5, human beings need religion because they seek perfection. And that's what we said for the 4 arguments. Human beings need religion because they're curious. They need religion because they want whatever is beneficial to them, protect themselves against harm, because they have a religious sense, because of the logic of probability. And 5, because they seek perfection. So this is kind of the general conclusion of the lesson. How is it built? This is an argument. It's built of these 3 premises. In logic, a premise is basically the parts that make up the logic until you reach the conclusion of an argument. So an argument is made up of premises and a conclusion. So those have to be in a certain logical relationship. Either some are larger than others or more restricted, or you just add them on one to the other, depending on the logic form that you're using. In any case, so when I say premise, that's all I mean. They're the parts reaching to the conclusion. So premise 1, humans desire perfection. And so, as he will say, this is should be instinctive, natural, straightforward. No one should argue it. That's why we say, again, he's going with the same logic and kind of the same argument. The second premise, perfection in humans come from basing all voluntary actions on practical reason. And this is the idea, the practical reason. Reason is one thing, but adding the word practical brings us back to the first lesson. So what we called in the first lesson ideology, and what we referred to between us as praxis or your system of action, in this lesson we're calling it practical reason. And that's what we said at the beginning, that you're still in the mental realm, you're still in the mental dimension. That's why you are at the reason level. It's your reason, it's your intellect. But now reason is telling you, do this, don't do that. You ought to and you ought not to, as we say in ethics or in moral philosophy. You ought to be good. Okay, that's practical reason. It's reason, so it's an intellect, but it's telling you to do something. So it's practical. It's not speculative. What's the nature of existence? What is beauty? That's speculative. Therefore, you must do, that's practical reason. Okay? And that's why if you read the works of some of the biggest philosophers, for instance, Kant, he has a book called The Critique of Pure Reason, and he has another work about the critique of practical reason. One of them, he's talking about your system of action, and the other one, he's talking about speculative philosophy, speculative intellect, the nature of how does a human being form judgments and arguments. Okay, it's logic, it's speculative. It doesn't tell you what to do. What to do is practical reason. Anyways, premise 3, practical reason requires theoretical foundations. So these are built on each other. Human beings desire perfection. 1. Okay. 2, perfection in human beings means we have voluntary actions, but those voluntary actions have to rely on your practical reason. 2. 3, or let's just say have to rely on reason. And 3, practical reason requires theoretical foundations. Going back to lesson 1, which is your worldview. Humans seek perfection. So the first part of the, or first premise, first part of the argument. First of all, this part should be straightforward enough, should be instinctive, natural enough. No one should really argue this, but some will. But let's say, generally speaking, every human being should agree with the idea that they seek perfection. They may argue about the definition of, or semantics of what perfection is. But generally speaking, and you can see it from the way we live, everybody is seeking to improve. No one wants to be seen in a bad light, let's say. No one wants their flaws exposed. Why? Even the stuff that shows you in a light that's, you're trying to be modest, you're trying to be, show humility, those may be interpreted as, you're trying to show your flaws, but in reality that's still trying to be perfect. You're leaning towards becoming a better version of yourself, right? It's an improvement. So it may look counterintuitive, but at the end of the day, no matter what you look at, and this is how we live our lives, no matter what we do, if you look at it, the main drive behind it is, it's because you want to be better. And you have an idea of what perfection is, or what your perfect state is, your ideal state should be. And you're moving towards that. And we're talking about your voluntary actions. That's everything we do and everything we don't do. Can be pure or can deviate. And we talked a lot about this. So if your nature is still in a very pure state, and no one is in that state, but that's what the Quran refers to as fitra. That's the argument, the way the argument is built. If your nature is in its pure state, it hasn't been corrupted, it hasn't deviated, it's not distracted, then your feeling, your direct feeling, it's an immediate direct feeling towards, you're leaning towards perfection, is a lot stronger and a lot clearer in your mind than if you are distracted or if you have deviated. Okay, that's one. Two, the same thing can be said about what you consider to be perfection and not perfection. So yes, you may go to one society and see them do something, and you would think, okay, but they're doing these things that I consider very flawed. Yeah, but to them they're not flawed. It's not to you. It's each action in the eyes of the agent, of the person acting. That's where you assess whether the action is performed based on the drive of seeking perfection or not. It's the person performing the action that has to say, why are they performing this action? And if you analyze that reason, you'll see that behind it, the main drive is, it's because they want to be whatever they define as perfect, in one way or another. And we'll talk more about that, the different schools of what perfection is. Yeah, I'll stop here for the first point. Second point, about humans seeking perfection. The author does not define perfection at all. There's no mention of what perfection is in the book. He just says human beings seek perfection. And so there's a few things that we can say here. One of the reasons why he doesn't is perhaps because in Islamic philosophy, for the past, let's say, 400 years, this has been such a classic argument that someone who's in it may not feel the need to explain what perfection is. The problem for us, living in a completely different society, is that this is a very controversial notion in the West. You can't just say someone seeks perfection. You know, it goes without saying. People will react right away to that and say, like, there's no such thing, and everybody's imperfect, and you have to accept that, and so on and so forth. So there's maybe a very good reason why he's not defining it, and that would help us a lot. Regardless of what we think perfection is, his definition would be what goes for his argument, and that's how we would assess it. But he doesn't provide anything. All basically he says is everybody feels in themselves they're leaning towards what is perfect, a perfect state of themselves, one. And two, if we take the opposite of it, no one wants to show to the world their flaws and their weaknesses and their defects. And why? It's because you want to be seen in the most perfect state possible, and that's normal. But that applies to every dimension of your life. That's the first thing. The second thing is, so let us look at the definition of perfection. We can provide multiple definitions. I think the one that we can concentrate on is, first of all, we take it linguistically, and I'm not going to go into all sorts of philosophical, meanders here. Maybe a good distinction also to make, and I'm saying there's a relationship between the notion of perfection and the notion of completion. So what's the difference between the two? Because in Arabic, the two terms are very close. Kamal or al-kamil in Arabic can mean perfect. That's usually how it's translated. But it can also mean something complete, something full, something entire. So what's the relationship between these two notionally? Specifically from Arabic. When we say something is kamil and something is tam, what's the difference between them? So if we take, let's say, a blueprint of a house. I made a plan, I want to build a house. And I go ahead and build the house. I can say the house is complete because I've built it. I look at the house and I say, but this house could be a lot better. There are much nicer houses. It could be, improved. So I start improving it. When the house was done, this is completion. It's full. It has met the minimal threshold, allowing me to call it a house. It's a house. There's a plan, there's a design, and I can check it off. Done. The house is done. Is it perfect? No. Perfection this is where perfection starts. It's a matter of degree. I can elevate this, whatever degree it is, I can make it higher. I can make it better. So perfection becomes, after you've met the minimal threshold, it's how high can you go? And the higher you go, the higher in the ranks or degrees of perfection you're going. So perfection is not an absolute. It's not a black and white. It's gray and it's infinite. You can keep going like this forever, but it's very tied to the purpose. And that's why in Arabic, both words are kind of going together. In English, I'm splitting them so that, because we're working with the notion. So completion gets you to the minimum so that you can call it a house. Perfection is when that house has become the best house it can possibly be. And that's the purpose of being a house. And this is where it gets very important to associate the notion of perfection with the purpose for which something is intended. And that's how we are going to define it. So if you go back in some dictionaries, like Raghib al-Asfahani, when he explains what perfection is in Arabic, when he says al-kamil, he says it is that which has fully or completely or perfectly, not to use the same word of the definition, something that meets the purpose for which it is intended. So the perfection, the point of a pen, I don't have a pen, I thought I had one. The point of a pen, thank you. The point of a pen is to write. So the perfection of a pen would be the best possible writing, right? And this is how we would look at perfection, looking at it. Perfection on its own, it's just that description that we gave. But it has to be applied to something, and then we can say of it, how perfect is it? And so someone oftentimes, when they argue against the notion of perfection, it's because in their mind it's a black and white thing. It's you're perfect or you're not. Perfection is degrees. A human being is a human being, but they can be more perfect as a human being. Or, to use the words more loosely, more complete as a human being. But they meet a minimal threshold, or they don't. And that's what we'll talk about later in the lesson. So the link with, this is a verse, the verse 2050, and I don't want to talk about it, but I thought I'd make sure that as we go through the lessons, I'd always try to associate the parts of the rational arguments with where they come from in the Quran and the Ruwayat, at least just a quick reference. So a quick reference, this is Surah Taha, 20 is Surah Taha, and it says that God is the one who has given everything its creation and then He has guided it. And so if you read the commentaries about this verse specifically, you'll see it has a lot to do with the idea of perfection. The difference in that verse is between the human being and everything else. Everything has its own perfection within it, except the human being, because the human being has free will. And that's what we'll talk about. That's the difference. So anyways, if anyone wants to kind of go back to the Quran and try to look at this from a more Quranic perspective, so I would say, chapter 20, verse 50, you can look into it, read the commentaries and see what it says. And even just think about the verse. What does it mean when the Quran says God is the one? This is Musa alayhi salam talking to Fir'aun. But there's a whole debate and discussion between them when Musa starts his mission and he goes to Fir'aun. One of the things, when Fir'aun asks him, what is this God you talk about? He tells him, God is the one who has given everything its creation. Allahu alladhi a'ta kulla shay'in khalqahu thumma hada. And then he guided it. And then God guided that thing which he gave creation. So he's separating between you're created and then you have guidance. So what is this guidance? Is guidance necessarily a prophet who comes to explain to you what to do? That's maybe how we understand guidance. But then is that what's happening to a bird? Or a turtle? Or a tree? Or a star? No. So what's this guidance? This is where it becomes completely different. Guidance can be completely two types. You have a type of guidance that is suitable for us in some aspects of our lives, which is this external prophet coming to us, explaining to us what we need. And then you have the internal guidance in our case, which is the fitrah and the aql. But the rest of creation, including us and our body and everything that's non-voluntary in us, it's doing what it's supposed to do. It's working perfectly. Your heart is beating and your stomach is doing its thing and your hair is growing and so on and so forth. Your body is guided. It's doing what it's supposed to do. The only thing that's not doing sometimes what it's not supposed to do is the human being. You look around you and everything is working according to a very meticulous law and order. Everything is guided. And that's why Musa alayhi salam says God is the one who gave everything its creation and then he guided it. So it's not like he wasn't successful at guiding it. The only difference is, and in the case of the human being, he gave him the free will, but he also guided him, except that he doesn't want to impose the guidance, so it's not an existential guidance, which is the case for everything else. The existence of it is guided. And that's what we'll talk about in point 2, which is plants, animals, human beings. So this is a very classic argument, so I'm going to stick with the way it's presented in the book. Basically, the way existence is looked at in medieval philosophy onward and until today, pretty much all of Islamic philosophy is still based on this system. It's the idea that if you look at existence, the lowest level that we start looking at, you can go lower than that, but for our purposes is vegetation or plants. And you see that we already share some things with all living organisms, the most basic of which, according to this system of philosophy, are plants. So what's special about plants that, for instance, you don't find in inanimate objects? Well, they grow, they live, they have life, and they grow. To what extent do they have free will in what they do? To our knowledge, none. It's automatic and it happens on its own. So the stuff that happens in plants, so the feeding, the reproduction, the actions that happen in the life of a plant, there is life and there's something happening, but these actions are non-voluntary. Okay, and so we move on to animals. Do animals have this free will? Do they act voluntarily? Yes, to a large extent they do. But it's based on what? It's based on instinct. It's based on what we call animal instinct. Each animal has their instincts. And if you go from one generation of animals to another, you don't see any difference, as you would see, for instance, in human beings. If you look 10,000 years ago, what bees were doing and what today bees are doing, they're still doing the same thing. They haven't built anything more sophisticated. They haven't taught their children to teach their children something new, which is what we find in human beings. And we can go on with the difference between animals and human beings like this. So when we look at animals, a lot more sophisticated than plants, there's something specific to animals, which is there is a free will, but there's an instinct. And their behavior is based on an instinct. So depending on which instinct comes in, it's not one, it's many, many instincts. So depending on the one that takes priority at that time, the animal will act in a certain way. He's not acting based on charity, as a human being may. He's not acting based on, let me seek knowledge, as a human being may, and so on and so forth. So what would be the perfection of a plant?
Becoming a plant.
Becoming a plant. Becoming the best plant it can be. And we're saying it's non-voluntary. But when we say that a plant is, let's say an apple tree an apple tree to be perfect is the apple tree that gives you the best apples. So there's a fruit, there's an ultimate purpose for the apple tree, which is to give you the best fruits and to give you seeds to create more apple trees. Okay, what about the animal? So we can look at the animal in itself, or we can even look at it from our purposes, very selfishly as human beings, and what we use it for. You know, a milking cow, or an elephant that carries loads for you, so strength, or meat, or whatever you want to look at, if that's how you want to look at it. And you say there's a specific purpose. Is the animal reaching that purpose? That's why we're trying to use the same definition consistently. Okay, so what about the human being? Do human beings grow and eat and reproduce just like plants? They do. Okay. Is there stuff that's activity going on in their world, in their dimensions, that's non-voluntary? There is. Okay, so that's check. That's part of a human being. What else is there? There's also free will, just like animals, and there are also animal instincts in the human being. So they want to eat, and they want to eat better, and they want to eat more. Okay, they want to rest, they want to reproduce, and so on and so forth. The instincts are all there. Same instincts as we find in animals. Okay, is there more? And this is where we see everything that's common, that's shared between the human being and the plants and the animals, that doesn't count for the perfection of the human. When I look at the perfection of an animal, I don't include the perfection of the plant or the vegetative perfection in the animal. I only look at what's specific to the animal. And I can go drill down further, and I don't look only at animals as a whole genus, as they say. No, I look at them as not the whole kingdom of animals. I look at the woodpecker. And I say, what's specific about this species? Or I look at an ant. What's specific about this species? And then I can see what is its perfection. To say this ant is perfect, or this woodpecker is perfect. So I can drill down, I can look at it collectively, or I can drill down to the specific species and look at it, right? I could do the same thing with human beings. And we'll talk about human beings in the next slide. I put in a star here so that I don't talk too much, because I want to use the next slide. So before we go into what we believe is the distinction, very quickly, and I don't want to talk for too much, this could be a very interesting and gigantic topic. Here is where we're going to see many schools of thought tell us what they think is the perfection of the human being. Or as we defined it, they're going to tell us what the purpose of the human being is. What's the essence of a human being? What makes a human being more human? What makes one human being more human than another human being? Based on how we defined it, that would be the perfection. So these are some of the big schools that have existed throughout history, and there is many more. So I thought I just mentioned them very quickly. So the first one is the school of wisdom. And so this comes to us right down from Socrates and so on and so forth, like the love of wisdom and the love of knowledge and reason. So they will say that the perfection of a human being lies in seeking knowledge, or seeking truth, or seeking wisdom. Philosophia, right? The love of wisdom. And so you can take it all the way from the Socratic tradition through the philosophers, especially the Islamic philosophers, they're very heavy on this, and until today. This is very important, and it can easily be associated with a lot of our traditions too, a lot of our narrations. And this is an important point. If you look at these schools, and this is something that you will see throughout anything that's done by human beings, and you compare it to the heritage that we have from our imams, because we didn't come up with this on our own, you see how unidimensional, one-dimensional the best minds have been. It's not that it's not valid. It's that they look at the world from one perspective, but usually it's at the expense of everything else. And then you come to our religion, and even further to our madhab and our school and our imams, and we see how they teach us to balance between all of these and not have one trump everything else. So if you look at these schools, for instance, wisdom and knowledge and truth-seeking, very important. They're giving priority to the mind. Reason above everything else, which can be valid, no problem. We move to another school, the school of love. The school of love in the philosophical sense, when we come to our religion, is what today we call Sufism, or the Gnostics, or the mystics, Irfan and Tasawwuf. Well, this is the school of love. They reject the mind, except very late schools like Sahrawardi and Mullah Sadra, who tried to combine the mind with the heart. But this is a complete, like Rumi and Hafid and Ibn Arabi, when they started, this is all based on love. They say the perfection of a human being is to completely annihilate themselves in their love for God. They should not exist at the end. Nothing is left of the human being except their love for God. So there is no mind. The mind will be a veil. The mind will prevent you from loving fully. It will always create obstacles. You have to remove it. You have to get rid of your mind, except very late schools that try to combine them together, as we said. So you see, they concentrated on another aspect. Is it a bad aspect? No. Is it the one that's supposed to take priority? Well, according to that school, it is. But what do Ahl al-Bayt say? Is there a place for love? And is it the one that trumps everything? Is there a place for the intellect? And is it the one that trumps everything? Right? That's how it works. Power. Another huge school. And it used to exist a lot more before. If you go back to the ancient Greeks, there was a group of people called the Sophists at that time. And those people were, basically they didn't believe that there's a fixed truth. So truth is whatever you can argue and argue with strength. And at the end of it, your value is based entirely on how powerful you are. And how powerful you are has nothing to do with anything except what you can grab and what you can argue. And so this is a tradition that comes from like it was an entire, we can call it philosophical, or Socrates would say it's an anti-philosophical school, but it's a philosophical system. And so it was very much revived by a very big philosopher called Nietzsche, Friedrich Nietzsche. So his entire system is based on the idea, that's why I wanted to read a quote from him. I thought it would save us a lot of time instead of trying to explain his philosophy and this notion that he has, which is called the will to power. This is a very big notion in the Nietzschean tradition or school and writings that he never really defined, and then it created other interpretations. In fact, that became a school in psychology. And this is why sometimes, you know, you hear people say, don't study philosophy. You don't understand the world if you don't study philosophy. You don't understand how disciplines take everything, their system, their worldview, they take it from philosophy. The ideas of Nietzsche, who's writing in a philosophical world, he says the will to power, which is basically your worth and value as a human being, is how much power you have, not weakness. The more weakness you have, the more non-human you are, and you don't even deserve to live. And of course, those are the notions that were taken by Nazi Germany. But people say, you know, he didn't intend them to be used in that way. That's another topic, what he intended, but that's what he said. And so those were taken and, you know, quoted again and again by the top Nazis, and their works until today, it's very well known. So I wanted to read one little paragraph, but maybe just a point about the psychology aspect. So when that notion was taken, it generated three big schools in psychology. One school took it as is, and the two other schools, it became kind of a dynamic between them. And I'm saying this because it falls under the same, if you reflect on it, you'll see that it's the same idea of there are different schools about the perfection of a human being. So Nietzsche is saying the will to power. Well, will to power became a school in psychology. Another school in psychology was Sigmund Freud's school about the pleasure principle. So everything is looked at from a pleasure perspective. And a third school, which eventually was called logotherapy, which is a school about meaning. That one was taken from another philosopher. His name is Søren Kierkegaard, and he was an existentialist and so on and so forth. He says that the greatest desire, and we talked a little bit about this last week, the greatest desire and need for a human being is to have meaning. So he talks about the will to mean, whereas here it's the will to power. Anyways, so I just wanted to read a little. So this is on page 2 of one of Nietzsche's his books. It's called The Antichrist. So instead of explaining what we mean when we say power, and I want you to think about today in the world we live in, and to what extent this is applied in reality, and then to what extent people accept or reject this in theory. So he says, what is good? Whatever augments the feeling of power, the will to power, power itself in man. That's what's good. What is evil? Whatever springs from weakness. What is happiness? The feeling that power increases, that resistance is overcome. Not contentment, but more power. Not peace at any price, but war. Not virtue, but efficiency. Virtue in the Renaissance sense, he was obsessed with the idea of Renaissance. Not a virtue in the Renaissance sense, virtue free of moral acid, because he considers morality an acid that eats away at your power. He accepts the moral or the morality of what he calls the Superman or the very strong man, and he has some people he refers to in history as being very Superman. The weak and the botched shall perish. First principle of our charity, so he's confronting his charity with Christianity. First principle of our charity is that, what he just said, the weak and the botched shall perish, which is the exact opposite of what Christianity says, right? The common, women and children first, that whole idea is part of our psyche. You go for whoever needs help first. He is flipping that on its head. And one should help them to it. Help them to what? Help them perish, right? The weak and the botched shall perish, and one should help them to it. We don't need the weak and the botched, the ones who are defective, the ones who are flawed, the ones who are weak, get rid of all of them. What is more harmful than any vice? Practical sympathy for the botched and the weak. So if you have sympathy, that is the greatest vice. And then he puts a dash and he writes Christianity. Okay, so this is just one little paragraph that I took from the second page of his book. It's called The Antichrist. He has many books. He's a very good writer. I encourage you to read if you want to. But I think more importantly is, can you find traces of this in today's society? Whether you're talking about the business world, the family world, the educational system, politics, economics. Is this not what really ends up happening? And is this what we teach, or do we say it's kind of a hypocritical thing where we say, no, we're all about charity and humility and helping the poor and those who are needy, but in reality, when the vote day comes, or when the policy comes, or who are we really? Anyways, yeah.
Can we ask questions now, or do you want
Sure. I prefer at the end, but don't forget it.
Don't forget?
Write it so that we don't forget.
I'll write it down.
It becomes a good discussion. Okay, and I'll go a lot faster for the rest of it. So there was a school, of course, in reaction to this school, which basically says the perfection of a human being is weakness. Because they could see the dangers that came from human beings who were powerful and strong, they started saying, no, your perfection is in letting go of everything and being the weakest human being, completely detached, having nothing and being weak. There's another school, and this one we find especially in the works like the Upanishads and very Oriental philosophies and wisdom systems. They say Gandhi was ascribing to that school, which basically says it's all about discipline and control over the self. This allows you to know yourself, and knowing yourself will allow you to know God and know the others. Okay, that's the whole system, the knowledge of the self. And then there's another school which basically says that your perfection is in the maximum enjoyment you can get out of life, or everything that's happening to you, or living in the moment, or so on and so forth. And such other schools. Human perfection. Long story short, human perfection lies in our voluntary actions. So now that we talked about a few other schools, he doesn't talk about any of these. I'm just trying to complement the discussion. This is what he says. And so this is what we believe in and what we consider to be the actual truth of the matter. What is human perfection? Is it in wisdom or love or power? No. Human perfection lies in our voluntary actions being based on reason. So, a few points. First of all, the desires of a human being go beyond the instincts. And so, I don't know if I can go back. Here we said plants, animals, human beings, and we talked about instincts. So now we have to go back and we say, so what's specific to the human being? Right? We said, what is specific to so-and-so plant? What is specific to so-and-so animal that is beyond what's common between it and the plants? Now we have to see, okay, what's common between the human being and the animals and the plants? That cannot be part of what makes a human being perfect or not perfect. This is not what's going to give you your perfection as a human being. So your desires are not limited to instincts. And any human being, mature, who has lived enough life, should be able to agree with this. We know that our desires go way beyond, and we've talked about a lot of these. And here are some examples. When human beings perform acts of charity, they feel good, which means it's meeting a need. I'm not sure how many animals would understand the notion of being generous or doing acts of charity. Prospective outlook. Human beings can think about the future. You see in politics now they're saying, is this the world we want to leave to our children? Or our children's children? What are they going to say about us in 500 years? That comes from somewhere. This is beyond the instincts we find in animals. Other instincts, for instance, the desire for more knowledge. An animal doesn't really have a desire for knowledge for the sake of knowledge. Same thing with the sense of beauty. Animals don't really act in a way that says I should do and I shouldn't do. That's ethics. And finally, the sense of religion that we talked about in lesson 1. Okay, so this whole thing is to say, it's come to the point of religion. So human beings have more than the animal instincts. So if anyone argues with that, I just gave a few. These are not mentioned in the book. I just mentioned a few. And the last one is the one that is in the book, which is religion. The sense of religion that we talked about in previous lessons. 2, human beings possess intellectual faculties that may be, to our knowledge, infinitely expanded. We don't yet know what's the limit of how much you can expand your intellect. So what are the purposes of the intellect? First of all, it allows us to imagine goals and objectives. You can imagine something you can move towards. That's not nothing. An animal may not have that. He will not be able, beyond the instincts, to imagine something and start moving towards it if it's not there. 2, it allows you to balance between all these desires and instincts that you have. You can, if you want to, not let any of them trump over the others. 3, it allows you to prioritize. So you can, if you want to, allow one of your desires or instincts to trump the others and become more important. And these are not nothing, and they can be explained in a lot more detail, but I think this is clear enough that we don't need to spend more time on it. Therefore, based on all of this, perfection for humans is to have a will, because the will is there, the free will is there, the will, but it's based on reason. This is the specificity of a human being. This is what makes it different from everything else. And its perfection is therefore going to be, to what extent can you live based on this, is going to determine how perfect you can be as a human being. Okay, so this was a side note that I'm not sure how much time we have, but it was more for people who are more materialists and they want to refuse anything beyond anything that's material. They only believe in what's material. And this is an increasing trend today. So you have your physical, let's say someone has a physical defect, since we're talking about perfection. Let's say I have an eye that doesn't work, or 2 eyes that don't work. Am I therefore less of a human being?
No.
Would they agree with this or not? That's my question. If they say that all that exists is matter, and everything is based on materialistic arguments, then if one of these materialistic aspects of a human being is defective, does that mean that they are now less of a human being than someone else? Or do we look at more? Anyways, it's just food for thought that I'm throwing out there. Then there are moral defects. And how do we explain those if we talk purely from a materialistic sense? Is it all hormones and chemical interactions in the brain and heredity and genes? Let's say you're someone with a lot of envy and cruelty. Is this because of your genes? Or the way you react is, the place where it comes from is very different. Is this something you can always fix with a pill, or does this become something more? Anyway, so I'm talking about this because there's a link with human perfection and are you more or less human? And it opens the door to that whole discussion or dialogue with someone who's fully materialist. Anyways, so we're saying, based on what we just presented here, that a human being, to be perfect, must rely on their reason. All actions they perform must rely on reason. So what does reason say? So that's our question now. So because we're saying that now, okay, I agree with you. I have all this background that tells me this is my nature and this is how I'm supposed to be. Therefore, everything I do, that's the key. That's why we say practical reason. Everything I do, because it's free will, my actions come from a place of free will, based on reason. So this is called practical reason. So what does practical reason say? What should I do? I agree with everything. What do you want me to do now? Practical reason requires theoretical foundations. So this is what brings us back to the first lesson and some of what we said on the second lesson. Practical reason, ideology, practical reason, praxis, your system of action, requires theoretical foundations, requires a worldview, requires a system of belief. The value of actions, any action that you perform based on everything we said, any action that you perform is going to be equal. You want to see how valuable an action is, how good it is. Then you have to look at how effective is it in allowing you to reach your perfection or the purpose for which you were created. So in other words, if you perform actions that go in the other way, then they become negative in value. So an action can be good and bring you to a higher level of perfection, or it's not neutral, or they bring you down. And in fact, anyone who spends a lot of time thinking about religion, you see that it's very clear. There is nothing neutral. Nothing stands still, not 1 second. Everything is moving in one direction or another at every instant, including you, including the purity of your soul and your mind and your body and everything. Everything is moving towards something, and it's your choice which direction it's moving in. Everything is basically counted in our ethics and our traditions. Our lives are counted in breaths, and every breath you have to see it as a step towards hell or heaven, up or down, perfection or imperfection. Anyways, need deep understanding of nature of essential purpose. If I want to be able to understand, because I'm saying the value of the action means that it performs that for which it was created, then I have to understand why was it created. So for me as a human being, I have to now understand why was I created? What's the purpose of my creation so that I can do something about it, right? Which brings me back to worldview. It's the existential questions. Why am I here? Where do I come from? What's the point of my creation? If suddenly you wake up somewhere, and there's plenty of movies done about that, you wake up somewhere and you know nothing. You have no clue where you came from, why you're here, what you're supposed to do, and you feel, because this is a reality of life, time is passing by, you have to do something. Maybe there's a danger, maybe there isn't, I don't know. You can't do anything. The only way you can do something is to try to find out some of these answers or make them up. So you assume, you make assumptions, and you say, okay, I must be here because, okay, you might be right and you might be wrong. But that's what the study of religion is trying to answer. Why are you here? What's the point? What's the purpose? What's the objective? And so, as we said, what is it for the human being specifically? But the same thing can go for anything else. For me to understand the perfection of a plant, I have to study the plant. to see why is it there. For an animal, same thing. For a human, the same thing. Again, here I said the importance of aql in Islam, and there's plenty of verses and plenty of narrations. I'm not going into that, but again, it's just to complement the, we have, for instance, narrations that say, "Man la aqla lah, la dina lah." If you have no reason, you have no religion. It's as simple as that. Or we have other narrations that say, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in one of the prophetic narrations, he says, God has not sent any prophet until he has perfected his reason or his intellect, to the point where his intellect is the most perfect one among all people, and then he's ready for prophethood. So not only is aql important for us, even for prophethood, God subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't randomly choose people just because, which is, according to some schools of thought, that's what they think. He's just a normal person. No, by our standards today, he would be more than what we consider a prodigy or a genius, or they're very special people, and then God adds to that special because he's sending them with a mission. So he gives them all the tools they need so that that mission is successful at the end. A few final remarks. So up to here, I think that's the lesson. Generally speaking, that's the lesson. These are just my thoughts on some of the stuff we said, and I think the importance of some of these notions for us in our daily lives. First of all, if we really look at this, we basically understand that we're saying if someone does not live their life in a way that gives priority to their faculties as a human being, they're not really living a human life. So basically we're saying they're living an animal life, or even worse. And in fact, if you go to the Holy Quran, there are verses that basically say that. They say they let them eat, drink, and play, basically because that's the way they're living. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling his prophet, let them do that. That's all they know from life anyways. Or there are people who are worse than quadrupeds or cattle, right? Or animals in general. Why? Because you're doing everything that an animal does, or worse, but you have all these additional faculties. So you're worse than the animal. When the animal does it, and that's why we said, when the animal does it, it's a perfection for the animal. But when you do it, it's condescension, it's an imperfection. You're sinking to that level. You're supposed to be a lot higher. Which faculties in your life and in your dimensions are you concentrating on? Are you working on? Are they the ones that make you more human, or are they the ones that make you more animal? Are you feeding animal desires in you? They're there and you have to feed them. But where are your priorities? And are you balancing the priorities in the right way? The first argument, though, that unexamined life is not worth living, the reason I wrote that is maybe that can seem harsh in today's world where, everybody has to be very politically correct and say the right thing at the right time to the right people. And so this may seem a little harsh. Well, how is it different than saying the unexamined life is not worth living? Is that not what we're saying? Are we not saying that ultimately we want reason to triumph, not human basic animal desires? We want reason to control all of that. This, the unexamined life is not worth living, actually comes from Socrates. It's in the Apology. The Apology is one of the works of Plato where he basically recounts, we don't know how accurate it is, but it's basically Socrates in his final court day. He's right there and they're basically telling him, if you don't agree with our religion, then we will kill you. And his answer is, the unexamined life is not worth living. If you're not going to allow me to examine life, it's not worth living. Kill me. No big deal. And he says after that, I'll continue examining in the next life. So death is just, you'll just put something and it'll just keep going. And that's why so many of our scholars say these were hidden prophets, right? Whether it's true or not, there's no proof for that. But there's certainly a lot of wisdom in a lot of what they say. Anyways, second point. So is it harsh? Well, I'll say it's as harsh as this. So if this is harsh, then yeah, maybe it's harsh. Importance of this definition. I think what's important to take from us, so for the lesson, it's good. It's important and I think it's clear, we don't need to push it more. But then if we understand this notion of perfection, what else can we do with it? And this is, I think, where it becomes a key notion. It opens so many doors. It helps you understand so many things. So first of all, the notion, and this is important, it's relative to itself. Perfection is relative to the self, to what you are supposed to be, or what the thing, whatever object we're looking at and assessing its perfection, whatever that object is supposed to be. So it is relative, but it's not an absolute relative. It's not a free-for-all. It's not fixed. It changes. Perfection is not one thing. There's context, but the context is what's the purpose, what's the essence, what's the nature of the object we're looking at. That's what's going to determine its perfection. So perfection is determined, but it's relative, because I can't apply the perfection of a cow to myself. A cow is different than me, and therefore its perfection is going to be different than my perfection. And then we can apply that within. So this, we talked all the way until now, and for the purposes of the lesson, that's all we needed. We talked about human beings. And it's good and important, I think, that's why I wrote beyond polemics at the top. I mean, if I'm arguing with someone who doesn't believe in God, or who doesn't believe in religion, it's one thing, and that lesson is good for that. But if I'm talking to someone who believes in God, who believes in the Holy Prophet and Islam, who believes in Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam, what else can I take away from this? So can I apply this? I can apply this. I have to look deeper into human beings and maybe not look at all human beings together. So if we apply it in a world like education, or cognitive psychology for children, or marital relationships, or this is where we start seeing, okay, so what is perfection in that setting? Is my perfection and the perfection of a child the same? When the child says a word, or he's learning to speak, or he's exploring his world, he is on his path to perfection, because at his developmental stage, his perfection is in that. I have to look at him not as a human being, I have to look at him as a child. What is the purpose of the child? From a developmental point of view, his purpose is to learn, to get ready for what's coming in life, right? So that also tells you what's the purpose of parenthood and how you're supposed to be. And we can apply that to, let's say, knowledge and faith. So if we look at someone, we can't say that two people's level of knowledge means they will, if they have different levels of knowledge or different levels of faith, that their perfection is going to be the same. And that we talked plenty about that. Perfection is going to change based on who you are, your level of knowledge, your level of faith, your level of background, what you know, what you believe, and so on and so forth. And there's a famous tradition called, a lot of people refer to it, Hasanatul Abrar, Sayyiatul Muqarrabin. This is actually not a tradition. Okay, this is something that was written by a master Sufi, maybe 200, 300 years Hijri, after the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And it was used so much after that people say it's a prophetic. It's not. But the idea behind it is perfectly acceptable, which is you have a rank of people referred to as Abrar. And those are really good people. They're the righteous. إِنَّ الْأَبْرَارَ لَفِي نَعِيمٍ, right? The Quran says. But they can't be compared to the higher level people that the Quran refers to as al-Muqarrabin. Those are the ones who are near God. Al-Abrar are the righteous. So they say Hasanatul Abrar, the good actions of the Abrar, if those same good actions were asked to be performed by the Muqarrabin, they would be bad actions. You can't assess them all based on the same grid. They're at the different level. For one person, I think his perfection would be that he just wakes up for Salat al-Fajr. That's all I need from him right now. His perfection is in that. Yes?
So then with that, based on that idea and thinking out loud here with the thought, then each person's punishment or reward would then depend on where they are at this level that you described, correct?
Correct, 100%. That's why you can't apply anything to anyone else. That's why you have to be relative. And that's why God says, leave it to me.
Exactly.
You can decide. Who knows what's going on inside?
Level of the capacity that they have.
That's all part of the same argument. So the same thing here, Hasanat al-Abrar, Sayyat. For one person waking up for Salat al-Fajr, that's a huge step in their path to perfection. To another person, I expect them to pray Salat al-Layl. Like at your level, come on, you need to move to the next level here. So this is the next step. They're not the same. The link with muhasabat al-nafs. So this is a link with ethics. So what's muhasabat al-nafs? It's your self-assessment. And we have plenty of ruwayat where the Ummah tell us, if you do not self-assess yourself and your deeds, you're not one of us. So self-assessment, I think at one level, a lot of people think it's at the end of the day or at the beginning of the day, at least once a day, the Imam said, you must dedicate an hour for this. The Imam said, not me. You must dedicate an hour to do self-assessment. A lot of people think, okay, what did I do? How much good did I do? How much bad did I do? I have to regret, I have to make sure I discipline myself that I don't repeat the bad stuff, the good stuff. I have to make, what triggered, what fueled me doing the good thing? Okay, I have to put myself in that situation so that it happens again. Okay, that's good. Okay, but there's one layer more than that, which is what were the intentions behind it? We're saying that your perfection is not what you did. It's not the action. It's to what extent it allowed you to reach your ultimate goal. Your ultimate goal is not to do the action. When I did the act of charity, what was my intention? To show off? If it was to show off, then it didn't allow me to reach my perfection. So it doesn't count. So in my muhasabat al-nafs, I have to add that as a layer. Is where does the action rank in my real scale of walking towards perfection? Not just actions. It's not a list of rituals that I did or didn't do. And then we see, I don't want to go into the details here, how the Holy Prophet lived, how Imam Ali lived. We see that they applied this to themselves. Imam Ali alayhi salam, he would, or the Prophet, they would do an action and it would seem so, I don't want to say insignificant, but so trivial. And then God eternalizes that in the Quran and says Imam Ali gave a ring in his prayer. What's a ring? Like, what's the worth of a ring? That a verse has to come down and all of humanity until the end of times have to read it and understand it. Why? It's not the act, it's the intention and what it meant for Imam Ali, the sincerity behind the act. That's what's praised. Or when we have Imam Ali alayhi salam in battle of Khandaq, at the last moment, when they say that there was a duel between them and there was a lot of dust and people did not know what was happening, they knew Imam Ali was on his chest. And they say, that's it, there was too much dust and we didn't see anything until Imam Ali came to the Prophet and the Muslimin kabbara. They said Allahu Akbar, they knew that it was over. And then they asked Imam Ali, they told him, why did you take so long? And in the riwayat, they said, he replied, he spat in my face and I had to take a moment to make sure that I'm not doing anything for myself as an act of revenge. Okay, because there's a path of perfection, every act is counted. There's a mission, I'm walking on this path. I can't do this for myself. Yes, I may get angry because you did this. I can't lose sight of the goal here. This is not for me. This is not an act of revenge. Anyways, and so I'm saying basically a little action may become a lot better because of the intention or because you understand where it fits on your path to perfection. And the opposite too. So you can take a bad action, but because of where it sits in your path to perfection, it becomes good. And we have an instance where this is 106 in the Quran, Surah Al-Nahl, verse 106. We have the whole history of Ammar ibn Yasir. I'm not going to go into the details, but he was basically, when the other Muslims, Bilal and Khubab and his parents, were taken to be tortured after the Holy Prophet left to Hijrah, and the next day he told his companions, follow me, the ones who are strong of you, stay behind and follow me. They were caught. And most of them were tortured. And the parents of Ammar were killed in that instance. And Bilal was tortured and Khubab was tortured. And then Ammar, when they told him, all they needed to do is say one word of kufr. To say we don't believe in Muhammad, we believe in the deities, the divinities of the polytheists. So all of them kept saying Ahadun Ahad. So they were killed or they were tortured. Ammar didn't. They told him say, and he said the word. He said, yes, I disbelieve. And then they all went back. So they released the ones who were alive, including Bilal, including Khubab, including Ammar ibn Yasir, the great companion of Rasul and Imam Ali. So they say when they reached there and they told the Prophet everything that happened, Ammar was very broken. And he had doubt in his belief that he should have done what the others did. Why didn't he? Maybe that was the right action. So they say the Prophet called him and told him, was your heart happy when you said those words? He said no. And then the verse of the Quran was revealed, which is this verse. And it says, except, it talks about those who believe and then they leave the belief, and then it adds, except those who have believed, who disbelieve, but basically, and their heart is not happy with it. So basically it's an act of taqiyya. It means nothing. The ritual on its own means nothing. You put it in the context and then it gets all its meaning. I'll go a lot faster here. Sorry. Final remarks. Do I have anything more? No. Relative notion. So again, for all of us, keeping in mind whose standards when we say perfection. We're always doing something, all of us. Everything that we're doing is a path towards some sort of perfection. Everything we're doing, whether we're aware or not. So the point here is, let's be aware. What are we doing? Whose standard of perfection are we enabling, empowering, feeding? What faculty, what instinct are we feeding? Here's a lot that we can say here, and I don't think we have a lot of time for that. Maybe I'll take 2 minutes to finish this. Sometimes we say that I think we can look at different aspects of something, but at the end of the day, I think it's important to concentrate on the perfection based on the purpose. So if I look at the eye is a beautiful construction. You can look at it chemically, biologically. You can see how it focuses in and out. You can see how it takes in light or not. Fascinating. All of that is beautiful. But let's say that eye does not see. Is any of that serving the purpose? No. So sometimes in our religion, we hear that if someone doesn't believe in a certain thing or doesn't have a system of belief, they have all these amazing actions going on. Yeah, but the purpose is not there. That's why it becomes an all or nothing. It's not an all or nothing, but there's a minimum threshold. If the eye can't see, the eye can't see. It's not performing any function. The function of the eye is to see. The function of the apple tree is to give you apples. If it's not performing that, then that thing is not there. It doesn't. The rest is secondary, or it doesn't count. It doesn't serve the purpose. And then the rest were very different things that we can take from different narrations, different stories from the Quran, from the traditions about standards. And we can see that different contexts have different standards of perfection, even in the Holy Quran. Bravery, for instance, where the Holy Prophet says about a man who was lifting very heavy things in front of people, and they said he's very brave because he can, lift these things. And the Prophet said the bravest of people is the one who can beat his desire. أشجع الناس من تغلب أو غلب هواه. And there's a lot to think about with that one. Or, for instance, how the Quran talks about when the people of Talut, they asked Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for a king, the Jewish people with the Prophet, and they asked Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for a king to help them into battle. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent them a king, a prophet. And they rejected him because he wasn't wealthy, the Quran says. He didn't meet their standard of perfection, which was wealth. To be a king, you must be wealthy. And their prophet answered, but God has given him 2 traits, which the Quran teaches us. Those 2 traits are really important in a king taking you into battle, which are زَادَهُ بَسْطَةً فِي الْعِلْمِ وَالْجِسْمِ. He gave him a lot more than he has given anyone, knowledge and physical strength. That's what you need in this battle. He's given him what he needs to meet the perfection standards, but you don't see it. And so this is another lesson for us. And finally, the honor. The Holy Quran says the most honorable among you is not the wealthiest, not. It's the most pious or the most religious, right? Inna akramakum indallahi atqakum. Again, something to be applied. And the last thing, the link with akhlaq, when Imam al-Sajjad alayhi salam, because we're on the verge, a lot of people have already left for Hajj. May God accept their deeds. We have a narration that says that one of the companions of the Imam went with him and he said, oh my God, there are so many people here this year performing the Hajj. And he says the Imam said, no, there's a lot of, and the Imam showed him. He says, I don't know what happened, but suddenly I was looking at animals circumambulating, walking around, performing the Hajj, performing the pilgrimage. And it didn't last long, and then suddenly he started seeing the people again. And the Imam wanted to show him something, wanted to show him the reality of what's going on in those people's lives, internally, spiritually. Those people are not human beings. And this is the link we're trying to do here. This lesson is about, are you a human being? What is the minimal condition to be a human being? We have in the Quran many verses, and we don't have time. We have many verses in the Holy Quran that make an analogy between certain behaviors or certain people and animals. And in fact, it says God transformed certain people into animals. Why? So some commentators say they weren't really transformed, they were transformed internally. I don't know, with these riwayat, and we have many at the time of the Imam, and even some of our scholars, they say they see other things, they see another reality, another nature to people. Where does this come from? So in akhlaq, in ilm al-akhlaq, they teach you that you have faculties. Your soul is made up of faculties. One of these faculties, for instance, is your aggressiveness and your strength and your power. One of these faculties is your ability to imagine. One of these faculties is, reproduction and eating and resting and all of that. These are faculties. Spiritual, psychological faculties you have. And you also have higher faculties that make you a human being. If as a human being you put all your time and all your energy into feeding those other faculties, you become those things. That's your reality. And the riwayat basically mean that when you come Yawm al-Qiyamah, this is the shape that you will take. And so some people, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed that reality in this world. People who are acting like as though they are monkeys, He made them into monkeys. He's teaching a lesson. He's showing that's the faculty that's coming out of you. That's the faculty that you fed, so you have become that. You have become a shaitan. Does not the Quran say that some people are like shaitan? Well, you have become, it's not a metaphor. You have really become a shaitan. You fed your imagination faculty so much, you have become a shaitan. You have become like cattle. You have become like a beast. Right? And so the Quran says, وَنَحْشُرُهُ يَوْمَ الْقِيَامَةِ أَعْمَى. He will come on the day of, because he was really a'ma. Because you have killed a faculty, so you will not have it يوم القيامة. So this is the link that we have to make. Yes, all of this is good for polemical reasons, if we're engaging in a discussion with someone in theology, but I think the link that we have to make with our own ethics and spirituality is very important too. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله الطيبين الطاهرين.